It only took one slap to shake an entire courtroom, but what followed in the next 4 minutes shook a city. It was supposed to be a routine arraignment in Charleston, South Carolina. Quiet Tuesday morning, in a courtroom that had seen decades of history, both just and unjust. But when Sergeant Rick Dalton, a third-generation cop known for his arrogance and unchecked power, slapped a woman he believed to be just another court employee, everything changed. He didn't know the woman standing in front of him, dressed in plain clothes and reviewing a file near the clerk's desk, was Judge Eleanor Banks, the highest-ranking black female judge in the city's history. Dalton, irritated and dismissive, barked orders as if he owned the room. When Judge Banks didn't respond, he slapped her across the face in front of attorneys, reporters, and 2 stunned officers in the back. The air froze. Coffee cups stopped mid-sip. The room held its breath as Eleanor slowly turned her face toward him, not in shock, but in absolute authority. And then, with chilling calm, she walked to the bench, took her seat, and revealed exactly who she was. That single act, driven by prejudice and ignorance, set off a reckoning. Eleanor didn't shout. She didn't demand. She asked one question that turned the room inside out. "Sergeant Dalton, did you just strike a sitting judge in open court?" The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was the sound of power beginning to crumble. The silence that followed Judge Eleanor Banks' question was deafening. Sergeant Rick Dalton stood frozen, his lips slightly parted, eyes darting around the courtroom as if searching for anyone to rescue him. But no one moved. Not the bailiff, not the prosecutor, not even the clerk, who now stared at Dalton as though seeing him for the first time. I didn't know who you were," Dalton stammered. "That's not what I asked," Judge Banks replied, her voice low but razor-sharp. "Did you strike me?" "Yes or no?" Dalton faltered. "You weren't in your robe. You thought I didn't matter," she cut in. "You thought I was beneath you." He tried to protest, but the courtroom had already shifted. A young associate attorney in the back discreetly pulled out their phone. Cameras were rolling now. What had been just another hearing had become a moment of reckoning, and Dalton was dead center in the frame. Judge Banks stood from her bench, slowly letting the weight of the moment settle over everyone. "If I were a white male judge sitting here in a robe, or not, would you have slapped me?" she asked. Dalton said nothing, but his silence was louder than any denial. "You'll take that as a no," she said coldly. "And now you've compounded that assault with arrogance and defiance." The bailiff, Officer Miles, shifted uncomfortably near the back. He was a veteran of courtroom protocol, disciplined and steady. Even he seemed unsure of what to do next. That was until Judge Banks called his name. "Officer Miles, is this courtroom currently under video surveillance?" "Yes, Your Honor, multiple angles, active and recording." "Good," she said, her tone unchanging. "Then let the record reflect that Sergeant Dalton struck a sitting judge without provocation on camera in front of multiple witnesses." Dalton's bravado began to fracture. His eyes flitted to the corners of the ceiling, where 2 small red lights blinked silently. Surveillance cameras, unforgiving and impartial. He took a step back. "I didn't mean to," he mumbled. Judge Banks raised her hand, signaling for him to stop. "You've had 20 years of not meaning to, Sergeant. I've read your file. I've seen the complaints 5 documented in the last 7 years. And I've seen how they disappear." Dalton's jaw clenched, and his face flushed crimson. He looked to the other officers for support, but none would meet his eyes. Even his partner, Officer Harris, now seemed to be inching toward the exit. "I have spent my life watching men like you mistake force for law," Judge Banks continued. "Mistake fear for order, mistake silence for consent. But not today." She stepped off the bench and approached the bailiff. "Officer Miles, place Sergeant Dalton under temporary detainment. Do not use restraints at this time, but do not allow him to leave this courtroom." Dalton's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. I was doing my job. That kid is a thug. I caught him with spray paint." "Enough." Her voice cracked like thunder. The gavel slammed twice. "You do not get to justify assault by pointing fingers at a frightened teenager." She turned back to the clerk. "Please enter into the record Sergeant Rick Dalton has admitted to laying hands on a sitting judge in open court. Let it be known this courtroom recognizes that as an act of criminal assault on a public official." And just like that, the empire Dalton had long believed would always protect him began to crumble. Dalton looked around wildly, grasping for support that wasn't there. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "You think you've won?" Judge Banks didn't answer immediately. She let him stew in the consequences. Then she stepped closer, her voice low and calm. "I think, for once, the right person is losing." As Officer Miles led him away, the courtroom buzzed not with gossip, but with a stunned, reverent hush. This wasn't just the fall of a corrupt officer. It was the beginning of something larger. A spark had been lit. Back in her chambers, minutes later, Judge Banks removed her robe with quiet purpose and hung it carefully. Her cheek still bore the faintest mark from the slap, but the pain was gone. What remained was the memory of every person who had walked into that same courthouse and left with worse wounds on their dignity that no camera had caught, no record had kept. There was a knock. Her longtime bailiff, Carter Lang, stepped inside. His voice was low. "They've taken Dalton to Holding Room B. Internal Affairs is sending 2 agents. Judge Banks nodded. "Thank you, Carter. We're just getting started." Carter hesitated, then added, "Word is his union's already called the mayor's office. They're scrambling." "Of course they are," she said without flinching. "But they're too late." She turned back to her desk, pulling out a fresh yellow legal pad. And with crisp, deliberate strokes, she began to write. List of prior complaints against Sergeant Dalton cross-reference with dismissed cases. Verify ADA approvals. Begin systemic review. The slap had not been the beginning. It had been the trigger. Now Judge Eleanor Banks was ready to tear the whole structure down brick by corrupt brick. The next morning, the courthouse stirred before sunrise. The halls were quiet, save for the distant squeak of a janitor's mop and the low hum of fluorescent lights. But behind the heavy door of Judge Eleanor Banks' chambers, there was no sleep, only the rustle of papers, the clicking of pens, and the sound of a system being dissected piece by piece. Eleanor, still in her tailored charcoal suit, sat at her desk with Carter Lang and 2 agents from Internal Affairs, Agent Rosalind Keene, a sharp-eyed investigator known for rooting out departmental rot, and Agent Marco Reyes, a younger but equally focused federal analyst. Between them lay a mountain of case files, sealed complaints, surveillance summaries, and more damning still names. 19 complaints tied to Sergeant Rick Dalton. 12 involved other officers under his command. 4 had been forwarded to the district attorney's office with recommendations to prosecute, only to be dismissed without reason. Body cam footage. Missing. Witness testimony unfollowed. Patterns identical. Carter exhaled slowly as he flipped through one thick folder. "That's not just negligence," he muttered. "That's protection." "No," Eleanor said softly, eyes narrowed. "That's a system built to bury truth before it can stand trial." A phone buzzed. Eleanor reached for it. The screen read simply, "Chief Nolan." She picked up without ceremony. "Chief?" Judge Banks Nolan's voice came through calm but tight. "I imagine you know why I'm calling. You've seen the footage." "I have." There was a long pause. "I'm not calling to defend Dalton," Nolan said. "But you need to understand the ripple you've started. It's not just going to shake a precinct. You're pulling at a thread that could unravel the whole department." "That's the idea," Eleanor replied. "I'm not your enemy. You've been silent for years," he sighed. "The union's breathing down my neck. The mayor wants answers. Now I hear you've looped in Internal Affairs directly. You're escalating this." "I'm not escalating. I'm revealing." The chief's voice changed, colder now. "You want Dalton? Fine. Ill back charges, but if you keep dragging in commanders, prosecutors past leadership, you'll cause a collapse we can't clean up. Eleanor's voice didn't flinch. Then maybe it's time we stopped cleaning and started rebuilding. The call ended with a hollow click. She stared at the phone, her expression unreadable. Carter, seated across from her, raised an eyebrow. That sounded like a threat in a suit. It was Eleanor answered. And that means we're getting close. Just then, Agent Keene stepped forward, holding a slim red folder. We found something. She opened it, revealing a transcript. It was surveillance audio recorded from a precinct locker room 2 years earlier. The voice was unmistakable. Dalton, laughing. You ever see her up close? That Judge Banks walks around like she owns the damn place. Thinks the robe makes her bulletproof. Another voice, unidentified. She ever come after you? Dalton again, still laughing. Let her try. I've got friends higher than her. She steps too far, she's gone. One complaint, and poof activist judge out the door. Eleanor stared at the page. Who else heard this? We just pulled it, Keene said. It was buried in a separate investigation file. Any ID on the second voice? Reyes spoke up. We're running voice recognition, but preliminary match suggests it may be Carson E. Ramsey. Eleanor's fingers curled into a fist. Adia Ramsey. The same prosecutor who had sat in her courtroom dozens of times, who had waved away excessive force cases like flies, who had always seemed too eager to cut deals with the likes of Dalton. There's more, Keene added. Last night there was an emergency meeting at the DA's office. Someone's trying to pull the Dalton case from your bench, citing conflict of interest. They're trying to remove me? Eleanor asked, though she already knew. If they succeed, Keene said Dalton gets downgraded to minor misconduct. You're labeled emotionally compromised. And it all disappears. Eleanor rose from her desk, crossed to the window, and looked out at the city. No, she said. If they want to make it public, let's make it public on my terms. She turned back, voice steady. I want a hearing. I want the press there. I want the record to show that I stepped down, not because I was biased, but because I refused to let them bury the truth. Reyes gave a low whistle. You want to go on offense? Eleanor shook her head. No, I want to go nuclear. By 9:30 a.m., the courthouse steps were crowded with journalists, protesters, legal analysts, and curious citizens. Reporters whispered into microphones, photographers jostled for position, and security paced the perimeter. Inside the main courtroom buzzed with tense anticipation. Judge Eleanor Banks stood outside the chamber doors, flanked by her loyal bailiff Carter Lang and Agent Rosalind Keene from Internal Affairs. Today she wore no robe, no gavel, no bench to shield her. Today she came not as a judge, but as a citizen confronting a machine. Inside Assistant District Attorney Carson Ramsey sat stiffly beside a state ethics board representative, a young man with a stiff gray suit and a name tag that read Elliot Parrish. He had the cold gaze of someone chosen not to arbitrate, but to sanitize. As Judge Banks entered, silence swept through the gallery. She took her seat at the front table and addressed the board with calm authority. I've reviewed the motion filed by the district attorney's office, she began. It claims that I am emotionally compromised and therefore unfit to preside over the case of Sergeant Rick Dalton. Ramsey nodded slightly, not making eye contact. It's a procedural concern, he offered. Given the physical nature of the incident, there's a reasonable basis to request recusal to protect judicial integrity. Eleanor leaned forward. Which is why I am voluntarily stepping away from the Dalton arraignment. Not because I am compromised, but because I refuse to let this case be buried quietly. A few heads turned in the press gallery. Pens scratched faster. I am also formally requesting, she continued, that the case be elevated to special review status and that a federal monitor be assigned to investigate every case involving Sergeant Dalton and every collaborator in his protection. Ramsey's shoulders stiffened. Judge Banks, this is not the venue to insinuate a conspiracy. I am not insinuating, Eleanor said. Her voice turned cold. I'm proving. She handed a manila folder to Agent Keene, who opened it and slid it onto the table. For the record, Eleanor said this file contains 3 complaints, 5 sealed internal memos, 2 missing body cam logs, and 1 transcript from a 2018 juvenile trial. Every single document bears your signature, Mr. Ramsey. You declined prosecution in 5 separate use-of-force cases involving Dalton. Gasps spread across the courtroom. Ramsey paled. Additionally, Agent Keene said, placing another file in front of the board, "We have documentation of a $15,000 transfer from a local law enforcement fund to a private legal defense pool. Half of that money was used to cover Dalton's legal expenses in a previous misconduct claim." "That's irrelevant," Ramsey began. "It's evidence," Eleanor countered. "Evidence of collusion not just between officers, but between the very people meant to hold them accountable." Then she asked the question that had been burning since the audio transcript, Mr. Ramsey, who protected Dalton when the 2019 body cam footage disappeared, the one where a 17-year-old boy ended up in the hospital. Ramsey opened his mouth, then shut it again. Keene answered for him. "We traced the missing video to an off-site server operated by a private contractor in Atlanta. That contractor holds a municipal security contract signed and approved by Carson Ramsey." The courtroom erupted, flashing cameras, murmurs of disbelief, and reporters surging forward. Ramsey stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. "This is character assassination." "No," Eleanor replied, evenly rising from her seat. "This is exposure, and it's long overdue." Parrish from the ethics board looked visibly shaken. "We need time to review this." "You'll have it," Eleanor said, her voice clear. "But let the record show, I stepped aside from this case not out of fear or pressure, but because I will not be a party to silence. The Dalton incident is not a fluke. It is a crack in the surface one that reveals a deeper rot beneath." She turned to the press gallery, eyes locking with a young black journalist in the front row. "This isn't about a slap. It's about a system built to protect power and punish truth. And that system is falling apart." From the back, someone stood and called out, "We believe you, Judge Banks." Applause broke out. Nervous at first, then gaining strength, Parrish called the room to order. But Ramsey was already gathering his things, his face white, his hands trembling. As Eleanor exited the room, Carter leaned in. "You think they'll come after you now?" "They already have," she said. Her phone buzzed the moment she stepped into the hallway. One new text from an unknown number. "You need to stop." No signature, no direct threat, just 5 chilling words. She showed it to Keene, who read it and said, "Good. That means they're scared." Judge Eleanor Banks didn't flinch as she stared at the anonymous message on her phone. "You need to stop." 5 words that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. Carter read the text over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "That son of a—" "Don't say it," Eleanor interrupted quietly. She turned away from the crowded corridor and walked briskly back toward her chambers, locking the door behind her. The moment it clicked shut, the air seemed to change. This wasn't about legal motions anymore. It was about survival. She handed Carter the phone. "Whoever sent this, find them." Discreetly. Carter nodded. "And your nephew?" Her voice dropped. "Pull him from school." Quietly. "I want eyes on my sister's house. No chances." That night, Sergeant Rick Dalton was quietly moved. Not officially transferred, not released, but relocated. No paperwork. No press statement. He was shuffled through the back corridors of the Charleston precinct like a man being smuggled out of a burning building. He was handed a burner phone, an unregistered vehicle, and a name, Eleanor Banks. Waiting for him near the rear exit was a man in a gray suit, older bald, and as cold as polished marble. Dalton narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "Oh." The man didn't answer. He simply tossed a thick folder into the back seat of the car. "Your lifeline," he said. "Or your anchor, depending on how you use it." Dalton opened the folder and froze. Inside were photographs of Judge Banks, her home, her late husband, and his breath-caught, her teenage nephew biking home from school, backpack slung loose over his shoulder. "This is surveillance," Dalton muttered. The man in gray smiled slightly. This is leverage. You've been useful to us in the past, Sergeant, but now you're a liability. Dalton stiffened. I gave everything to this department. And that's why you're still breathing, the man replied smoothly. But understand this. If you continue to sit quietly while Banks controls the narrative, we will not protect you. Dalton clenched his fists. So what do you want me to do? Remind her who holds the power, the man said. No threats. Just fear. Just enough to make her feel vulnerable again. He walked away, leaving Dalton with a folder full of warnings and a decision that would determine the rest of his life. The next morning, a package arrived at Eleanor Banks' chambers. No return address, no markings. Inside, a single photograph of her nephew, time-stamped 2 days earlier. On the back, scrawled in block letters, "Stay in your lane." Eleanor stood frozen, not in fear, but in fury. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She picked up the phone and calmly said, "Get me the U.S. Marshals Service." That same day, she sat across from 3 federal marshals and 2 DOJ officials in a secured conference room inside the downtown federal building. She slid the photo across the table. My nephew, taken without his knowledge, delivered to me this morning. The lead marshal, a gray-haired man named Mercer, studied the image. You're certain this came from Dalton? I'm certain someone protecting him sent it, she replied. And I'm certain he'd never be bold enough to act alone. What are you asking for? One DOJ official asked. Eleanor didn't hesitate. I want full protection for my family. I want Dalton placed under federal custody by the end of the day. And I want an emergency judicial order freezing every case tied to his testimony. One of the DOJ lawyers raised an eyebrow. That would cause months of disruption. Then let it, she said flatly. Justice isn't supposed to be convenient. Within the hour, the marshals traced Dalton's burner phone to a parking garage near the harbor. He hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. The man who once swaggered through courtrooms was now pacing inside a rented sedan, clutching a duffel bag filled with cash, a second burner, and an illegal Glock. He had hoped the photograph would rattle her. Instead, it had awakened something that now had him hunted. As he reached for this garage stairwell, a voice echoed behind him. Sergeant Dalton. He turned gun halfway drawn. 4 U.S. Marshals stepped from the shadows, weapons already trained on him. Put it down, Dalton. He froze. No bluff left, no backup coming. Slowly he dropped the weapon, then the bag. Then finally his knees hit the concrete. At 3:14 p.m., Judge Banks received a secure alert: Dalton in federal custody. Unarmed. Arrested without incident. She didn't smile. There was no victory in this moment-only confirmation. In her office, surrounded by files, she sat with Agent Keen Carter and DOJ investigator Francis Kwan, who had just returned from Washington with reinforcements. We've reopened the Julia Spence case, Kwan reported. The autopsy was inconclusive, but the coroner's report altered after submission. Someone tried to erase her, Eleanor whispered. Not anymore, Kwan said. A joint task force is now active. Internal Affairs, the DOJ federal investigators, and an independent judicial review board. Dalton's not talking yet, but he will. Eleanor looked at the names, the files, the patterns that spanned a decade. This isn't about Dalton, she said quietly. He wasn't the rot, just the smell. We're going after the tree now. 3 weeks later, the federal courthouse in downtown Charleston was standing room only. A perimeter of U.S. Marshals formed a solid ring around the plaza, where protesters, journalists, and curious citizens gathered shoulder to shoulder. Some carried signs that read, "Justice for all," or "Justice for none." Others clutched framed photos of loved ones lost to a system that had long protected its own. Inside, the air crackled with tension. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. Judge Eleanor Banks wasn't seated behind the bench. Not today. Today she sat in the front row, not as a judge, but as a citizen, as a witness, as a woman who had risked everything to expose a system built to silence people like her. At the center of the courtroom stood Sergeant Rick Dalton, now gaunt, pale, and visibly shaken. Gone was the swagger. Gone were the polished shoes and pressed uniform. Today, he wore a plain brown jumpsuit, the numbers on his chest stark and dehumanizing. The prosecutor stood her voice clear and precise. "Your Honor, the state of South Carolina calls Judge Eleanor Banks to the stand." Every head in the courtroom turned. Eleanor rose with grace and determination, walking slowly to the witness box. She took the oath with calm certainty, her voice unwavering. Then she sat her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Judge Banks," the prosecutor began what happened on the morning of April 11th. Eleanor took a breath. "I was struck in the face by a man who believed I didn't belong. A man who thought I was invisible because I wasn't in my robe. Because I am a black woman in a courtroom he thought he owned." The room was silent, hanging on every word. "And what did that moment mean to you?" "It meant," she said, her tone tightening, "that the system I had given my life to no longer protected those who served it with honor. That respect, law, and truth had become conditional, reserved only for those who looked a certain way, carried a certain badge, or stood behind the right desk." She looked directly at the jury, but it also meant something else, that silence was no longer an option. The prosecutor nodded, no further questions. Dalton's defense attorney approached, young, nervous, and clearly outmatched. He fumbled with his notes. "Judge Banks, do you believe you're above the law?" She tilted her head as though puzzled by the simplicity of the question. "No. I believe I am beneath it, like everyone else." "That's the point." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. "Would you agree that your personal feelings may have influenced the way this investigation was handled?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "I brought truth into the room. If that truth makes people uncomfortable, that's not bias. That's justice finally doing its job." The defense attorney had no rebuttal. He stepped back, quietly. For the first time, Dalton looked at Eleanor not with anger, not with defiance, but with the empty eyes of a man who finally understood it was over. 2 days later, the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts. But Dalton's name wasn't the only one making headlines. Behind closed doors, ADA Carson Ramsey had resigned in disgrace. He was reportedly negotiating a plea deal in exchange for information about several high-ranking officials. Judge Benjamin Halcraftoft, the same man who had once sworn Eleanor into office, had been suspended pending a full judicial investigation. 2 precinct captains were fired. 3 officers turned state's evidence. And the mysterious handler who had tried to intimidate Eleanor, he had vanished. No trace, no name, no trail, just shadows. The ripple had become a wave. A week later, a statewide review board was launched to examine over 140 prior convictions tied to Dalton and his associates. The Charleston Police Department was placed under federal oversight. A civil rights commission was convened to audit prosecutorial conduct and complaint handling procedures. It was a rainy Thursday when Eleanor walked back into the courtroom where it all began. She stood before the empty bench, staring at the chair that had once been hers. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the polished wood. Carter entered behind her coat, still damp. "They want to name the judicial conference room after you," he said. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "I haven't died." He grinned. "It's weird, I know." Her smile faded. "Will the reforms stick?" "Some will," Carter said. "Others will take time." She nodded. "That's what they never tell you about justice. It's not a moment, it's erosion and rebuilding." He hesitated, then asked quietly, "Are you sure you want to do this?" She turned toward him, her eyes steady. "I have to." That afternoon, before a packed state judiciary review board, Eleanor Banks submitted her formal resignation. "I believe in the law," she declared. "I believe in its power to protect, to punish, and to heal. But I also believe that institutions must be rebuilt by new hands. I lit a fire. It's not for me to stand in its glow." One board member stood. "Judge Banks, your actions have inspired a movement. You could remain and lead that change." Eleanor smiled gently. "Change doesn't need a monument. It needs momentum." She paused at the doorway, then added one final request. "Make sure the next woman who wears this robe doesn't have to fight just to be heard." And then she walked away, not from the fight, but from the weight of having carried it alone for too long. 2 months after her resignation, Eleanor Banks returned to her family home in Mount Pleasant. The quiet felt foreign at first, like an unfamiliar rhythm in a song she once knew by heart. But as she sat on the porch, watching the golden sun slip behind the hills, peace began to settle around her, not the kind that comes from victory, but the kind born of knowing you did not stay silent. That afternoon, her nephew biked up the long driveway, his backpack swinging from one shoulder. The moment he saw her, he dropped the bike and sprinted up the steps. "Auntie Eleanor," he called, wrapping his arms around her. She held him tightly. No words, just the quiet hum of justice that finally had a face. "I saw you on TV," he said into her shoulder. "You made them listen." She pulled back, looked him in the eyes, and said softly, "I made them look. Whether they listen is still up to them." Together they sat side by side, as the breeze whispered through the trees and the last light of day touched the porch. Charleston still bustled in the distance, but for now the world was still. True justice isn't found in loud speeches or powerful titles. It lives in the quiet strength to stand when others kneel to speak, when silence is safer, and to carry the burden of truth even when no one is ready to hear it. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Leave a comment below and share what justice means to you. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more powerful real-life stories that challenge silence and honor courage. Because sometimes the most powerful voices aren't the loudest, they're the ones that refuse to be silenced.